And starting in chapter 5, which starts on page 84, we're going to talk about protein, which is the cellular foundation. So until the middle of the 19th century, many scientists thought that all life was composed of a single basic chemical, protein. Protein is present in every living cell, and it makes up almost half of the dry weight of a cell. So if we took out all the water, protein would make up more than, or almost half. And so second to water, protein is the most plentiful substance of the body. Those are literally the first 3 sentences in your chapter. The United States is a nation of meat eaters. There are a lot of people in the U.S. consuming meat, and most Americans are unable or unwilling to plan a balanced meal without a meat option. Many Americans won't eat a meal unless it also contains meat in it. And you can see the chart down at the bottom of page 85. It shows you sort of the trends that started in 1909 to 2012 that turkey has really gotten more popular. Chicken has just completely exploded and is kind of the forefront now. It's the one that's the most. And then pork stayed pretty steady, but beef kind of peaked around maybe just before 1980 and is slowly declining. But I mean, it's still more than pork and chicken, or it's more than pork and turkey. Chicken wins. Proteins are large molecular structures, and as we talked about in chapter 2, proteins are made up of amino acids. Those are the building blocks or the monomers of protein, which is the polymer. All proteins are made from a combination of 20 amino acids. So if you think of the amino acids like the alphabet, and you can make hundreds and I mean, there's probably like millions of word combinations that you could create with the alphabet. That's what we're looking at with the 20 amino acids. So you eat the proteins, they are consumed, and then they are hydrolyzed in the small intestine by the HCI, or hydrochloric acid, and they are broken down into individual amino acids for absorption and utilization. The distinguishing feature of an amino acid is the amino group. You'll see that unique side called the chain side, or R group, is what is the part of that structure that's going to vary. So of all of those amino acids, the R group, the R1, R2 that you're seeing in that image, that's the part that changes and is why we see the 20 different amino acids. So 2 amino acids together form a dipeptide, just like saccharides. Proteins can also be called peptides. And so when you get a long chain of these amino acids all chained together, it's going to be called a polypeptide. And the number of amino acids in a protein varies a lot, anywhere from 100 to 300. But every protein has a very specific number that it has. Proteins are classified into three different groups. So first they have the 9 indispensable amino acids. These used to be called essential amino acids, but they're no longer called that. They're called indispensable. It means we cannot do without them. And they are required in our bodies. In our diets. All of them are required in our body. The dispensable amino acids are essential for the body, but they can be produced from the indispensable amino acids. So we have to eat at least 9 of these types of amino acids, and we sort of, like Legos, take them apart. And then if we need one of the dispensable amino acids, then we just sort of create it with our leftover Legos and with some of our carbohydrates, right? Remember from the last chapter. So There are 9 indispensable amino acids, and if you flip to page 87, you'll see in table 5.1 on the right hand side there, they have the list. So there's the indispensable ones, the dispensable ones, and then that last one there is conditionally indispensable. And that just means that when you go through different stages of growth or development or life, sometimes you need to consume these in your diet because your body can't make them, and then your body sort of figures it out in other parts or stages of life, and so you no longer need to eat them. And so you can see there are the 3 types of amino acids: indispensable, dispensable, and conditionally indispensable. So therefore, as long as you are consuming the sufficient amount of those indispensable amino acids and indispensable proteins, then you're going to be able to make adequate amounts of your dispensable ones. If you are not consuming variety and getting all of those 9 indispensable amino acids, then your body isn't going to be able to make those dispensable ones. When those 9 indispensable amino acids are provided from food in adequate amounts in order to maintain something called your nitrogen balance and permit growth, then the food is said to provide the high quality protein. So you'll see that at the bottom of page 87. At the bottom of page 86 is where it talks about high quality proteins. Basically, it is one food that contains all of those 9 indispensable amino acids. These will include meat, like chicken, pork, beef, lamb, veal, goat, and rabbit. Poultry, like chicken, turkey, duck, and wild game birds, and all types of seafood. So essentially animals. Animals themselves contain all of those adequate amounts. It contains all of the 9 indispensable amino acids. Then you flip over to 87, you'll see that there are also low quality proteins. And what this means is if you only ate that one food forever, that was the only source of protein you ever got, then it would not have all of the indispensable amino acids. It's hard to break old habits. So basically, if the only thing you ever ate again was black beans, then you would not have all of the indispensable amino acids. You wouldn't be able to synthesize all of your dispensable amino acids, and you would be protein deficient. As long as we'll talk about it later, but basically all of the plant sources, so legumes, nuts, and grains, they do have protein in them. And when you eat enough of them, you can get enough protein, but if you only ate one, you wouldn't get all of those indispensable amino acids. All right, so that nitrogen balance, because protein has nitrogen in it, and we break it all down and apart so we can absorb the amino acids, we're going to have nitrogen balance. We don't do anything with the nitrogen. So we take it in and we can use it to make proteins, but if we don't need to make them, then we just need to get rid of it. And so if we have a nitrogen balance, then all of the nitrogen that's in the proteins that we're eating, we're going to consume, and then we're also going to excrete it. So through feces, urine, and from our skin, we're going to have the same input as we have output. With a negative nitrogen balance, a person who is healing from a burn or an illness is going to excrete more nitrogen than is ingested. So essentially they're holding on to more of those amino acids because they're not creating new proteins, they're just repairing old proteins, okay? With a positive nitrogen balance, this is going to be in periods of growth. This is where we're sort of creating tissue and muscle and things like that from nothing. We got to start from scratch. And so this is going to be during childhood or during pregnancy. When you eat protein, you're going to retain a lot more. You're going to take in more nitrogen than you're going to give off because you have to hold on to it in order to synthesize new proteins. So the physiologic role of protein And while there are a lot of other nutrients that play a role in protein's ability to do these things, protein isn't like, it's not just protein being used for these things we're going to talk about on this slide and the next one. We do need other proteins that are other things besides protein. This is what protein specifically is for. So for one, it is going to generate new body tissues. It's especially necessary for periods of growth. So anytime in infancy, childhood, adolescence, and pregnancy, and also like with wound healing and recovering from an illness, if you have surgery, a fever, anything like that. You're going to need protein to build those new tissues. It works the same way essentially for like muscle growth and things like that for like bodybuilders. And then the repair of body tissues. So body proteins are constantly being broken down, and so we have to replace them. And then production of essential compounds. So amino acids do help to regulate enzymes and hormones in our body. And another structural compound that protein kind of plays a role in is that it is a part of collagen, which we know is part of our connective tissue that supports body structures. Most people think of it as just like collagen in your skin, but collagen is what helps to have all of your connective tissue more fibrous. And this is important, especially for hygienists, because if someone has some kind of collagen deficit, I've never seen it, but if they did, then they would have a really hard time with periodontal disease, because periodontal disease is essentially connective tissue. So something to keep in mind. And then the regulation, oh, that's on the next slide, hold on. Here we go, the regulation of fluid balance. So here we talk about blood albumin. And albumin is a protein that will actually draw the water from interstitial space, which is the space between tissue cells, right? So what this does is if there's any areas of swelling or edema, right, then blood albumin will draw that water, that's H2O, from that space and pull it back into the bloodstream. So it helps to keep the blood pressure and the pressure from the inside of the lumen of the blood vessel going. And then next is resistance to diseases. So antibodies or immunoglobulins are the body's main protection from disease, and those are made from protein. So low protein levels have a negative effect on someone's immune response. As we remember from chapter 2, protein it plays a very large role in our ability to transport fat through our blood system, right? Because fats, they are hydrophobic, and so our body makes those lipoproteins that have that hydrophilic layer on the outside, that phospholipid layer, and that is going to help to transport all of that important stuff around. And then lastly, and for a reason it is last, is energy. So protein can be broken down and that skeleton be used for energy, which is the same amount of energy we would get from carbohydrates. So it is 4 calories per gram of protein, but it's not really its main function. Protein shouldn't be used for this, because when it is, then it's not available for us to use it for all of the other 6 things we talked about. All right, so protein requirements. How much protein you need depends on your body size and your rate of growth. So large people need more protein than small. Very active people need more protein than sedentary. And then anyone who is in those stages of life where they are growing, or maybe they're growing another human being, then they need more protein too. So the National Academy of Medicine has determined that the daily minimum requirement in order to stay healthy is going to be 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, right? But because the recommended dietary allowance, RDAs, which I think is pretty funny because your book said in chapter 1 that we weren't going to be using RDAs anymore. I don't know about that. Now we are, I guess. Because they want to give us a little bit of a buffering, you know, we don't want to recommend people get the least amount, right? Because then some people will get less than that. So they come out and say that people need to get 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, a kilogram is not a pound. These are totally different, and I'm sure you know that. So if you're interested, you can convert your body weight over to protein, or into your body weight in pounds into kilograms, and then times that by 0.8 to see how many grams of protein you should be eating in a day. The recommendation for the percentage of your overall caloric intake should be anywhere between 10% to 35%. If you're going through those stages of life where you're growing, or you're needing to heal, or you're older and things are breaking down a little bit more, then you might consider upping the percentage of protein within staying inside your caloric needs, okay? So for someone who is 150 pounds, this would mean consuming approximately 56 grams of protein. And then higher intake may lower the risk for type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, osteoporosis, and sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is the muscle degeneration that we see in elderly sedentary individuals. The dietary guidelines indicate that more than half of the United States is meeting or exceeding the protein food recommendations. So people here in the US are not protein deficient typically. And we're going to talk about what protein deficiency really looks like. But there's a reason you don't know what it looks like until you take a class on nutrition, because it's really not a thing here in the US. They do recommend limiting the amount of protein in your diet and going on a low protein diet when you have diseases of the liver or the kidneys, because the liver and the kidney are very involved in both synthesizing and breaking down proteins, and the kidneys mostly because they need water. And we'll talk about how much water you need in order to break down proteins. Excuse me. Then if you have liver or kidney diseases and you talk to a registered dietitian, they may put you on a low protein diet. And then vegetarianism is increasing in the last few years here in the United States. I did a quick Google search, and it looks like vegetarianism is anywhere between 8 to 15% here in the US, just depending on who you talk to. We'll get into vegetarianism later too. This slide right here comes from box 5.2 in your book, which is on page 89. So you can see that they have some recommendations in order to implement those 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines in relation to protein. So some of their recommendations would be to have a healthy eating pattern that includes a variety of protein foods and nutrient-dense forms. They recommend choosing foods that will keep you within the appropriate caloric levels to maintain a desirable weight for your height. They say to choose for lean meats like white meat or chicken instead of like steaks and things like, I guess, red meats, things like that. To remove the visible fat from meat, to remove the skin from chickens, They want you to limit the amount of processed meat and poultry because of the added sodium and sugar that is in those foods. They recommend preparing your food without additional fats added, like frying it. They recommend using like sauce and gravy really sparingly because they have a lot of additional fats and salts and things. To choose unsalted nuts and seeds and soy products at least 2 times a week, but you have to be careful because sometimes nuts and seeds will be very high in calories. So you have to kind of eat those in smaller portions. To choose seafood, but not fried, at least twice a week in the amount that's indicated in that chart for your height, weight, and growth. And then to eat more beans and peas. This is a great choice too from the last chapter, which we know because they're high in fiber. So if you eat beans and peas, you'll kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Well, that sounds horrible. Save 2 birds with 1 stone. And then choose legumes, which is like beans or peas, or tofu for the protein food at least once a week, or substitute beans for at least like half of the meat choice, like when you eat it in a big meal kind of thing. And then to choose non-fat or low-fat dairy products as long as you stay within your caloric needs. This slide really just talks about like the different types of food and how each one of these foods has protein in it. So it's like the age-old, like plants do have protein in them. They just don't have as much protein per like the amount, like it's just not very dense protein. Typically they have a pretty good ratio as far as like protein to calorie level because they have less calories, so you have to eat more of them in order to get the same amount of calories, which means in eating more of them you'll get close to the same amount of protein. But anyway, so 1 cup of milk has anywhere between 8 to 9 grams of protein. 1 ounce of chicken, which is the light meat and cooked, it has 9 grams of protein in it. 1 ounce of cheddar cheese has 7 grams. 1 cup of oatmeal has 6 grams of protein, and 1 cup of cooked white rice has 4 grams of protein. Americans are consuming adequate amounts of protein. They're not really meeting the recommendations for the subgroups within the protein like food groups. So if you look in your book on figure 5.5, you'll see what some of those subgroups look like. So according to your sex, size, and activity level, the MyPlate and Healthy Eating Pattern does recommend anywhere from 5.5 to 6.5 ounces of lean meat, poultry, or fish daily for adults. The dietary guidelines recommend 3 cups of fat-free or low-fat milk and dairy products in Americans 9 years of age and older. And then it talks about bioavailability. So if you look at the bottom of page 90, you'll see that word bioavailability. It talks about how when you eat something, your body is going to absorb only so much of it. And if you have too much, like you eat too much of whatever, your body doesn't absorb it, right? Or if you eat something with something else, then it might inhibit the way that your body absorbs it, right? Or maybe your body has a hard time absorbing things, so you can eat all of the thing that you could possibly, put into your mouth, and you still won't absorb it, kind of thing. So that's where bioavailability plays a big role. How much of that nutrient is there and able to be absorbed in our body. So they talk about lysine here. I think it's pretty interesting because later in this chapter it talks about how, like, in order to prevent protein deficiencies, they add lysine to cereal. But then right here it says that by binding the lysine to the cereal, it makes it unusable to the body. So just wait, we'll get there. I'll show you when we do. Okay, so who's at risk for not having enough protein? Well, elderly individuals, older adults are at risk. Individuals with a low income, because sometimes they're eating foods, but the foods aren't very high in protein or quality protein sources. Strict vegetarians or vegans. Individuals with a lack of education who are unwilling to shop wisely. So people who don't take classes in nutrition, and they eat junk food all the time. They probably know that food isn't good for them, but they don't care. And then patients who are chronically ill or hospitalized, anyone who is medically compromised, those people might have a hard time absorbing the protein. Even if the protein is there and it's available, you can't. That makes me think of that TikTok, like, is this available kind of thing. Oh, if you haven't found that, you need to go check that out. We talk about sarcopenia in this section. So sarcopenia is the progressive or the degeneration of muscle mass and strength as people age. It is natural. And then there is increasing evidence points to importance of a fairly equal distribution of protein intake throughout the day. So eating a little bit of protein at each meal is going to be important. You wouldn't want to, have a protein shake in the morning and then don't eat a single food that has protein again until the next day, kind of thing. That would be less effective. So a severe protein deficiency will cause something called protein energy malnutrition, or it is also sometimes called protein energy undernutrition, like PEU. You might see both of those. And we really don't see these. These are the kwashiorkor and marasmus, which we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So here in the United States, we don't see them, but sometimes with dialysis, or someone who's very ill, someone who is going through like cancer treatments, who is unable to eat, they sometimes have these sorts of issues. But in developing countries, we see that poor nutrition can result in delayed eruption and exfoliation of deciduous teeth. So we see children who, after they are weaned, which I don't know if you guys know, but the world average of breastfeeding, like how long a child is breastfed, is actually 4 years old. So here in the United States, the average is, I actually don't know, it's probably somewhere between 8 months to a year is when breastfed babies are weaned. But in the world, it's actually one of the most important sources of food for children in like those developing areas. So kids, they typically tend to stay breastfeeding for longer. And so what we see is that when there is poor nutrition in the mother, then they stay breastfeeding longer, and we also see this delayed eruption in their teeth. An insufficient intake of protein can create that negative nitrogen balance, which we talked about, right? And we talked about how if you don't get enough protein, then it's going to decrease your nitrogen reserves. That means you're giving away more nitrogen than you're consuming. That's that negative balance. And so it's going to decrease the nitrogen reserves and our blood protein levels. And then in malnourished children, secretory immunoglobulin A, or SIGA, levels are going to be depressed, which could play a role in their increased susceptibility to mucosal infections. And then PEM, which is that protein energy malnutrition, can be a major reason for increased incidence of NOMA, which we're going to talk about, and necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. Yeah, that's it for this slide. So NOMA is that progressing necrosis. It is usually starts as an ulcer, and it will spread, and it's going to produce extensive destruction of the lips, cheeks, and tissues that cover the jaw, and it comes with a really foul odor as well. The thing about NOMA is it's kind of considered like gangrene, but of the oromaxillofacial area. And then the next one is NUG. It looks like your book hasn't gotten the update about ANUG yet. That's okay. So this one is going to be associated with that erythema, right? It's very, very bright red. And it has the necrosis of the interdental papilla. So those punched out little embrasures are going to be there. It's very, very painful, and it's typically accompanied by a metallic taste for the individual, and then also a foul odor. The two main ones you're going to want to know for your boards is going to be kwashiorkor and marasmus. So NOMA and NUG are, yes, they are protein energy malnutritions, but they're not like the most extreme versions. They're sort of more reversible kind of things. But kwashiorkor and marasmus are the ones that if there is a question about protein deficiency on your boards, it'll probably have something to do with these two. So kwashiorkor is that form of PEM. It occurs from the lack of high quality proteins. It means that the child is probably receiving some sort of protein. Maybe their family only has carrots or something, so they're getting one kind of it, but they're not getting a complete protein, or they're not getting enough of those complete proteins. And then, but they're still getting enough calories. So that's the important thing here, is that they have enough calories to sustain life, but they don't have enough of that protein specifically. So the symptoms for that are going to be the edema of the extremities, torso, and face. You can see that in the little boy on the left in this picture. You can see that swelling around his ankles and around his cheeks. The hair color can change and it can fall out. There's anemia, obviously it's that iron deficiency, lethargy because they don't have enough protein for their muscles, and then that cracked, peeling, and infection-prone skin. So, anytime you have a protein deficiency of some kind, those immune cells are not going to be functioning the way that they should. You're going to be very, very prone to getting infections, to getting sick, things like that. It says opportunistic. So, any bacteria or virus that can get a hold of that individual will. So children who are at risk are kids between 18 to 24. Again, this is that sort of breastfeeding time frame where kids are beginning to be weaned and they don't get a full protein anymore. Marasmus is going to be when the infant doesn't have protein and they don't have enough calories in their diet. So the difference here is going to be the edema that we see, right? Right, remember how we talked about the blood albumin and how it pulls the interstitial water out, right? And it can reduce edema. Well, in children with this, they don't have that blood albumin, so the edema stays in the tissue. And with marasmus, though, we don't see that, so we don't see the swelling, and they're just essentially starving. Okay, so on the reverse side, when there is an overconsumption of protein, and if that relates to health problems. So here in the United States, there hasn't been an upper limit that has been established as far as safe levels. There's been no determination of that. Right now, it looks like Americans eat around 150 to 200% of that recommended daily allowance, right? And so the thing here we need to remember is that there could be a fluid imbalance. So when protein intake is really high, you have to drink a lot more water. We talked about hydrolysis, right? And how you need water in order to break down all of those, caloric macronutrients, right? The metabolism of water or of protein is actually, it needs more water than carbohydrates and fats do to break down. So in order for you to break down 100 calories of protein, you would need 350 grams of water compared with only 50 grams of water for that 100 calories of carbohydrates or fats. So you can see how if someone is, they have kidney disease, right? And we see a lot with people with kidney disease, they need water a lot. So with someone who has kidney disease, if they are also on a high protein diet, then the protein that they are consuming is going to pull a lot of that water from their system and take it to breaking down the protein instead of nourishing the body. So people who eat a very, very high protein diet, they desperately need to drink a lot of water. It's kind of one of the reasons why when I talk to people about protein and protein diets and things like that, that's one of the things where I'm like, if you're on protein, if you take protein supplements, if you're eating protein, a high protein diet, you have to drink water. Higher protein diets have shown some support for weight control because there is a certain amount of satiety that goes along with eating higher protein diets. And then they talk about dietary protein can aid. It always says like may. It may do this because they don't want to, they don't want to make any claims because the research is a little flawed. So it may aid in weight loss by increasing satiation and then increasing muscle mass, maybe, and increasing thermogenesis. The idea of thermogenesis is that if you build more muscle, that muscle will then burn more calories, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily true because the more you burn, the more hungry you are. So, I mean, I guess it might be true. And then decreasing energy efficiency is going to be one of those dietary protein things. So if you are using a high protein diet in order to see weight loss, then the book recommends the goal should be about 120 grams of that high protein daily, and you want to distribute it evenly throughout your day. It does talk about that if your source of protein is going to be red meat, and then the full fat dairy products, that you're going to see, my dog is tired of me doing this, you're going to see a risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. That's going to go up because of the amount of saturated fat that is in those protein sources. And then we already talked about it, but high protein diets can be pretty harmful for people with kidney diseases because of that water, and then also because of the amount of nitrogen that's going to have to be excreted. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that has taken us through to the end of chapter 5, although if you're with me here, you're probably also on page 95. This one begins the health application 5, which talks about vegetarianism. And I mean, as you guys know, I don't eat animal products. So this one is just super interesting for me. And it's a growing trend here in the United States. Since 2014, it's actually grown from less than 1% of the US was vegan to now we're sitting, veganism sitting right around 3% of the United States, so around a little more than 9.5 million Americans are considering themselves vegan or some type of vegetarianism. So if you turn to page 89, there is a box 5.3 which goes through the terminologies for the different types of vegetarianism. So, if you have a patient who is following one of these diets, this is what those words mean. So a flexitarian will eat some fish and poultry. Basically, they're a vegetarian that is more flexible. They eat some types of meats occasionally. Vegetarian doesn't mean a whole lot in the world of vegetarianism because it's some people will eat egg and some people will eat dairy and then some people won't. So when someone talks about, if they have some type of restriction, you might ask more questions about it. Anyway, turn back to page 97. This one has that My Vegan plate because the American, dietary people, they do say that there is a healthy way to be vegan and vegetarian, that they are not inherently going to be deficient, but as with every single, diet, both omnivorous and herbivore, you do have to be aware of the limitations and the guidelines. So just like for people who eat meat, we need to educate them on, trimming the fat off of foods and trimming the skin and eating lean meats and, eating plants and things like that. For vegans, we have to recommend, that they have some type of vitamin B12 supplement. Because we'll talk about it when we get to vitamins, but vegans don't eat a lot of supplemented foods with B12. And then at the end of Health Application 5, this one is a little bit more near and dear to me because I would be very offended if someone were to completely write me off just because of my dietary decisions. And so the last paragraph, it says, when working with vegetarian or vegan patients, keep the lines of communication open by respecting their decision unless eating habits are potentially harmful. So, if you get a vegetarian or a vegan who sits down in your chair who is clearly deficient in some way, it's important to just listen to them, see why they choose what they chose. And then for patients who have an interest in pursuing a vegetarian diet, they should be encouraged to do so. It's not for everyone, and that's okay. No one, there are a lot of crazy people out there who are telling you that you're wrong and everything you do is wrong, but that's not the best way to get you to, be open-minded. So, it's okay if you don't want to eat the way that I do or the way that anyone else does. That's okay, but it's just important to understand that just because we do things differently doesn't mean that either one of us is wrong, and I think that we should all be really open to hearing what other people think and how other people feel about diets and foods and things like that. So if you are interested in this kind of stuff, the vegetarianism and the My Vegan plate, then that information is here. I wanted to bring it up with this chapter 5, even though it isn't part of the material. You're not going to be quizzed on this, absolutely, but it is here, and I know a lot of you guys know this about me, so I wanted to at least mention it.